Something is shifting between the United States and its closest allies, not in a way that shows up immediately on television screens, not with dramatic announcements or emergency summits, but quietly, inside planning rooms, defense ministries, and long conversations that never make headlines. And the people most concerned aren't politicians giving speeches, they're defense officials. For decades, the foundation of America's alliances rested on one central idea: predictability. Allies didn't always agree with Washington, they didn't always like its decisions, but they believed they could anticipate them. That belief allowed countries to plan together, militarily, economically, strategically. That belief is now being quietly re-examined. This is not a collapse of alliances. No treaties have been torn up, no partnerships dissolved. But assumptions are shifting, and when assumptions change, planning changes too. Defense officials think in long timelines, 5 years, 10 years, sometimes decades. They don't react to headlines, they react to patterns. And the pattern many are noticing right now is uncertainty, policy swings, abrupt strategic shifts, decisions made faster than coordination can keep up. From their perspective, this creates risk. Risk isn't always about hostility. Sometimes it's about unpredictability. Alliances function best when everyone knows the rules, when commitments are clear, when signals are consistent, when intentions don't need constant reinterpretation. When those conditions weaken, allies don't confront, they adjust. That adjustment is already underway, quietly. In Europe, defense planners are asking new questions, not whether the U.S. will remain powerful, but whether U.S. priorities will remain stable long enough to build around. In Asia, partners are reassessing timelines, how quickly they can develop independent capabilities, how much they should rely on shared systems, how exposed they might be to sudden policy reversals. These are not public debates, they are internal calculations, and that's what makes them significant. From Washington's perspective, alliances may still look strong. Joint exercises continue. Statements reaffirm commitment. Diplomatic language remains supportive, but beneath that surface, the tone has shifted. Defense officials describe it as caution, a subtle move away from automatic alignment, not distancing, but diversification. Diversification is what you do when you don't want to rely on one option alone. It's insurance. Insurance against uncertainty, insurance against political volatility, insurance against having to react too late. This matters because alliances are not just symbolic, they are operational. They depend on shared assumptions about command, logistics, and response. When those assumptions are questioned, coordination slows. And in defense planning, speed matters. What worries officials most isn't any single decision, it's accumulation. Each unexpected move forces planners to add contingencies. Each contingency makes systems more complex, more cautious, less seamless. Over time, this changes behavior. Countries start planning around uncertainty instead of through cooperation. The United States has always been the anchor of many global security arrangements. Anchors don't need to move to cause concern, they just need to feel less fixed. Allies aren't asking whether the U.S. is still committed. They're asking how conditional that commitment might become. That distinction is subtle, but critical. Conditional commitments require backup plans. Backup plans require resources. Resources redirected toward independence are resources not spent on integration. This is how alliance structures slowly evolve, not through confrontation, through preparation. For Americans, this shift is easy to miss. The U.S. is geographically secure. Its defense posture is global, but allies live closer to risk. Their margins are thinner. Their tolerance for uncertainty is lower. That difference in perspective is driving this quiet shift. Defense officials are trained to imagine worst-case scenarios. They don't assume stability. They plan for disruption. And right now they see a world where alignment cannot be taken for granted in the same way it once was. This doesn't mean allies are turning away from the U.S. It means they are turning towards self-reliance. At the same time, that dual movement is delicate. It preserves partnerships on paper, while changing them in practice. In the next part, we'll look more closely at what kinds of planning adjustments are actually taking place, how allies are hedging without headlines, and why these moves signal concern, not rebellion. Because the most important shifts in global security rarely happen on stage. They happen quietly. How allies are quietly adjusting without making a scene. To see what's really changing, you have to look at behavior, not statements. Publicly, everything still sounds familiar. Commitments reaffirmed, partnerships praised, unity emphasized. But behind closed doors, planning is becoming more cautious, and caution is never accidental. One of the clearest signs of this shift is how allies are approaching defense planning timelines. For years, many countries built their strategies assuming long-term U.S. involvement, shared command structures, integrated logistics, joint response plans. Those assumptions reduced costs and increased speed. Now planners are adding contingencies. Contingencies are polite words for uncertainty. They don't replace alliances. They sit alongside them. In Europe, some defense ministries are accelerating independent procurement, not abandoning U.S. systems, but reducing reliance on them, diversifying suppliers, strengthening domestic production, deepening coordination within Europe itself. These decisions aren't framed as political statements. They're framed as resilience. Resilience is what governments say when they want to avoid signaling distrust. In Asia, the adjustments look different. There, the concern isn't just reliability, it's timing. Allies are asking whether U.S. responses will align with their own threat windows, whether decisions will be fast enough, whether priorities will remain consistent during crises. So they're investing more heavily in autonomous capabilities, missile defense, cyber resilience, regional coordination that doesn't require waiting for approval. Again, not separation, preparation. Defense officials describe this as hedging. Hedging doesn't mean betting against the U.S. It means refusing to bet only on the U.S. This has operational consequences. Joint exercises still happen, but scenarios change. Assumptions are rewritten. Command flexibility increases, which sounds good, but also means less integration. Less integration means slower coordination during real emergencies, not because anyone wants it that way, but because shared systems depend on shared certainty. Another quiet shift is information flow. Allies are increasingly careful about how much they depend on centralized intelligence structures. They still share, but redundancy is growing. Parallel assessments, independent verification, separate planning tracks. This isn't paranoia. It's risk management. Defense officials worry about fragmentation, not because fragmentation implies hostility, but because it weakens collective response. When everyone plans slightly differently, unity becomes harder to activate, and in moments of crisis, hesitation costs time. What makes this especially sensitive is that none of these changes are designed to provoke. They're designed to avoid vulnerability. That makes them almost invisible. Politicians rarely announce these moves. They're often buried in budgets, procurement decisions, and technical agreements. But defense officials notice patterns, and patterns tell stories. The story they see right now is not collapse, it's recalibration. This recalibration reflects a broader reality. The global environment feels less stable, threats feel more complex, and political volatility feels higher than it did a decade ago. In that environment, allies feel pressure to control more of their own destiny. The United States hasn't lost influence. But influence now competes with uncertainty, and uncertainty changes behavior even when power remains intact. This is why defense officials are worried, not because allies are leaving, but because alliances function best when they are effortless. Right now, effort is increasing. Every additional contingency, every parallel system, every independent capability, it all adds friction. Friction doesn't break alliances. It slows them. For Americans, this raises an uncomfortable question. If allies are planning more independently, what does leadership mean in practice? Is it still about coordination, or is it shifting toward persuasion? Because leadership that must constantly reassure is different from leadership that's assumed. In the final part, we'll step back and look at the larger implications, what this quiet shift means for U.S. influence over time, whether trust can be restored without structural change, and why moments like this don't announce turning points, they reveal them later, because in global security, the most important changes rarely arrive with warnings, they arrive with adjustments. Its defense posture is global, but allies live closer to risk. Their margins are thinner, their tolerance for uncertainty is lower. That difference in perspective is driving this quiet shift. Defense officials are trained to imagine worst-case scenarios. They don't assume stability, they plan for disruption. And right now they see a world where alignment cannot be taken for granted in the same way it once was. This doesn't mean allies are turning away from the U.S., it means they are turning towards self-reliance. At the same time, that dual movement is delicate. It preserves partnerships on paper, while changing them in practice. In the next part, we'll look more closely at what kinds of planning adjustments are actually taking place, how allies are hedging without headlines, and why these moves signal concern, not rebellion. because the most important shifts in global security rarely happen on stage. They happen quietly. When alliances change quietly, the most important thing to watch isn't what's said, it's what's planned, because planning reveals what people truly believe about the future. Right now, the plans being drawn up by America's allies suggest something subtle but significant. They still want partnership. They still value cooperation. They still see the United States as essential, but they no longer want to be fully dependent. That difference matters. For decades, U.S. leadership worked because it felt structural. It didn't need constant reinforcement. Allies organized their security, budgets, and strategies around an assumption that American involvement was steady, predictable, and enduring. That assumption reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty is the enemy of long-term planning. What defense officials are responding to now is not weakness, it's volatility. Policy shifts that arrive quickly, signals that change tone, priorities that feel less anchored than they once did. Even when intentions are sound, volatility introduces doubt. Doubt doesn't cause confrontation, it causes preparation. This is why so much of what's happening is invisible to the public. Countries don't announce contingency plans, they embed them, they build them quietly into procurement, doctrine, and command flexibility. By the time those changes are obvious, they're already normalized. For the United States, this creates a paradox. America remains extraordinarily powerful. But power alone doesn't guarantee leadership. Leadership depends on confidence, not just in capability, but in continuity. When allies feel they must constantly adapt to political shifts in Washington, they plan differently. They shorten timelines, they reduce exposure, they prioritize autonomy, not because they want distance, but because they want control over their own risk. This doesn't mean alliances are failing. It means they're evolving under pressure, and evolution is rarely reversible. One of the most important consequences of this shift is psychological. Trust, once stretched, doesn't snap back instantly. Even if policies stabilize, even if rhetoric calms, memory lingers. Defense officials don't forget periods of uncertainty. They account for them, forever. For Americans, this matters in ways that aren't immediately visible. Alliances amplify U.S. power. They extend influence without requiring force. When allies hedge, that amplification weakens slightly, not dramatically, but enough to matter over time. That can mean slower coordination in crises, more negotiation before action, less automatic alignment. These are not failures, they are signals, signals that leadership now requires more explanation than it used to, more reassurance, more consistency. The deeper question is whether the United States is prepared for that shift, prepared to lead in a world where authority must be renewed continuously, where trust cannot be assumed, where influence depends as much on predictability as on strength. Because the world has changed, threats are faster, information spreads instantly, political cycles feel shorter. In that environment, allies value stability above almost everything else. What defense officials are worried about isn't abandonment, it's erosion. Slow, quiet, hard to measure erosion. And erosion doesn't make noise, it shows up later, when decisions take longer, when coordination feels heavier, when leadership requires more effort than before. This moment doesn't mark the end of anything, but it does mark the end of automatic confidence, and that's a turning point, even if it doesn't look like one yet. Whether this shift deepens or stabilizes depends on choices made over time. Consistency, communication, clarity, not dramatic gestures, but sustained predictability. Because in global security, the strongest alliances aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones that don't need to be questioned. Right now, questions are being asked quietly, and that's why defense officials are paying close attention. The world isn't pulling away, it's adjusting, and adjustments, once made, tend to stay. That's what makes this moment worth watching, not for what's happening on the surface, but for what's changing underneath. Its defense posture is global, but allies live closer to risk. Their margins are thinner. Their tolerance for uncertainty is lower. That difference in perspective is driving this quiet shift. Defense officials are trained to imagine worst-case scenarios. They don't assume stability. They plan for disruption. And right now they see a world where alignment cannot be taken for granted in the same way it once was. This doesn't mean allies are turning away from the U.S. It means they are turning towards self-reliance. At the same time, that dual movement is delicate. It preserves partnerships on paper, while changing them in practice. In the next part, we'll look more closely at what kinds of planning adjustments are actually taking place, how allies are hedging without headlines, and why these moves signal concern, not rebellion. because the most important shifts in global security rarely happen on stage. They happen quietly.